Today, I've been thinking about the odds of dying in a strange way, especially if your life is online. Probably low, but never zero. Hey, it's Nathan Cole, and in this episode, I'll be sharing strange deaths of influencers, from a shoreline meal that left an entire table frozen in place to a farmer found dead in his own field without a single sign of struggle, leaving even authorities unsure what actually happened. It was August 22, 2016, in Batangas, Philippines, and nothing inside Mina Rojas's home suggested anything was wrong. The table was set, the food was plated, and her phone was already recording before anyone took the first bite. Mina was 32, raising her 14-year-old son Leo with help from her mother Elena. Money had been tight for years, and like a lot of people in that position, she started looking for something she could turn into income without leaving home. She filmed herself foraging along the shoreline and turning what she found into meals, building a small but steadily growing audience around her videos. It felt practical, and more importantly, it felt familiar. And I get that. When you've done something enough times, you stop seeing it as risky. You just see it as normal. The tide had gone out, exposing wide rock pools along the coast. Mina moved carefully across the wet stone, collecting shellfish and small sea life, while Leo moved alongside her, occasionally pointing things out. Elena followed behind, occasionally questioning what Mina picked up. From the outside, it looked routine, something she had done enough times to stop second-guessing. At one point, Mina reached into a shallow pool and picked up a small octopus. As it came out of the water, bright blue rings appeared across its body. Elena noticed immediately and hesitated, asking if it was safe. Mina didn't treat it as a concern. She had handled different sea life before and believed that proper cooking would make it safe to eat, not realizing the toxin wouldn't break down with heat. The octopus was kept with the rest of what they had collected. Nothing about that moment forced them to stop. That evening, Mina prepared everything into a seafood pasta. The kitchen smelled normal. The portions were served like any other dinner, and the three of them sat down at the table together. It looked like a normal dinner, the kind you wouldn't remember the next day. Leo took a bite first, then Elena. Mina joined in, speaking casually as they ate. Within minutes, Elena slowed first, bringing her hand to her throat. Leo said something felt strange, but his words didn't come out clearly. Mina slowed halfway through chewing, her hand hovering above the table like she'd forgotten what she was doing. Elena pushed her chair back, but only halfway. Her legs didn't follow. A spoon slipped from Leo's hand and hit the floor louder than it should have been. And that's where the pattern breaks. Leo tried to speak again, but his mouth didn't form the words properly. Elena pushed against the table to stand, but she couldn't get all the way up and dropped back into her seat. Mina turned toward them, her hands moving slightly, but not with full control. There was no clear moment where anyone fully understood what was happening, only confusion, with each of them reacting in fragments as their bodies stopped responding. Just small movements that didn't work the way they should, and that's how it unfolded. Leo's movements slowed, then stopped completely. Elena's attempts to stand gave out beneath her, dropping her back into her seat. Mina remained upright the longest, her movements weakening more gradually before she began to lose control, her shoulders lowering, her breathing becoming shallow. She tried to push herself away from the table, but her body didn't respond. Only small movements followed. No one could stand, reach for help, or leave. Around them, everything remained untouched. By the following morning, after none of them had been seen or heard from for hours, a neighbor became concerned when Mina didn't show up for work and Leo missed school. Authorities were called to the house. When they entered, there were no signs of forced entry or disturbance. The table was still set. The food remained where it had been served. Mina, Leo, and Elena were found in their seats. During the investigation, authorities recovered Mina's phone and reviewed footage from earlier that day and evening. The recordings, along with toxicology results, confirmed exposure to tetrodotoxin traced to the blue-ringed octopus collected from the shoreline. Investigators noted that the toxin blocks communication between the brain and the muscles, gradually removing control without causing immediate pain, consistent with how all three were found, still seated at the table. The cause of death was determined to be respiratory paralysis. This story bothered me more than I expected, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because nothing in that room looked wrong until it was already too late. And the next case follows that same pattern, except this time, it doesn't happen at a table. It happens somewhere that looks even more open, even more harmless. It was September 14, 2013 in La Jolla, San Diego, California. From the cliffs above, the ocean looked calm, slow, even waves rolling toward the shoreline, nothing that stood out as dangerous. Eli Mason was 30. Tori Dane was 26. Together, they ran a small outdoor channel built around doing things with minimal gear. No heavy equipment, no unnecessary protection, just movement and instinct. Eli knew the coastline well, and Tori knew how to turn tight, natural spaces into something visually striking. They had done cave entries before, often without helmets or flotation, because that was part of what their audience came for. That day, they picked a sea cave below the cliffs, wide at the entrance, dark and clean inside, the kind of place that frames light perfectly if you position it right. It was exactly the kind of shot they built their content around, tight, controlled, and just risky enough to stand out. Tori adjusted her camera while Eli watched the waterline, timing the waves. They entered during a calm gap between sets. The first stretch inside felt stable. The water moved gently, rising and falling just enough to keep them in place. Tori lifted the camera, keeping the entrance behind Eli as he moved further in to set up the shot. The cave narrowed as they went deeper, not sharply, but enough that the walls curved inward and the ceiling dropped lower. The opening behind them still looked wide and bright, but the section they moved into held the water differently. It didn't flow through, it lingered. Eli shifted closer to the back wall, adjusting his position to stay centered in frame. Tori stepped sideways, raising the camera slightly to keep both of them aligned with the entrance. The first wave pushed them deeper than expected. Before they could steady themselves, another hit, harder, faster, with nowhere to step. The water compressed as it entered the narrowing space, accelerating as it moved inward. Eli was forced sideways into the rock, his shoulder striking first. He tried to correct his position, but the force didn't release immediately. The water pulled back, just long enough for them to try to reset, but the pattern had already shifted. Another surge followed seconds later, faster, heavier. This time, Eli was driven directly into the wall behind him. His head struck the rock at an angle, sharp and uncontrolled. Tori reached toward him, but the water pulled her off balance before she could stabilize herself. The next wave hit before either of them could recover. Inside the cave, the water no longer moved in a single direction. It rebounded. Each surge slammed inward, then reflected off the rock walls, colliding with the next wave entering behind it. The space compressed the movement, turning it chaotic, pushing, pulling, and striking from different angles. Tori was thrown sideways into the wall. Eli didn't regain his footing. His body remained partially upright for a moment, held in place by the pressure of the water before dropping against the rock. Tori tried to move toward the entrance, but each attempt was cut short by the next surge, forcing her back into the narrower section. There was no stable point, no clear way out. Moving toward the entrance meant pushing against each incoming surge. Waves came seconds apart, enough to react, not enough to escape. From outside, it looked manageable. Inside, the cave had become a surge chamber. The water kept cycling, driving them into the rock. When it settled, they didn't return. Their bodies were found the next morning. Both had severe blunt force injuries. No fall, no drowning, no single cause. Without witnesses, it wasn't immediately clear what happened. During the investigation, authorities reviewed footage, tide data, and weather patterns. Offshore conditions had shifted, creating uneven waves that the cave amplified. Each surge compressed, accelerated, and rebounded, colliding with the next. It wasn't one impact, but repeated collisions in a confined space. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from wave-driven impact. This story is very disturbing on how space can lie to you. It looks open, it feels breathable, and then, suddenly, it isn't. And the next case takes that idea even further, because this time, the danger isn't outside. It's inside a room designed to feel controlled. If you're still here, I appreciate it. Seriously, I spend a lot of time digging into cases like this, especially the ones that don't get much attention. So if you're into this kind of breakdown, consider subscribing. It was November 3rd, 2015, in Seodaemun-gu, Seoul, South Korea, and the archive basement felt like it always did. Quiet, controlled, and sealed off from everything outside. The air was cool, the lighting low, and nothing in the room suggested anything could go wrong. Lena Park was 22, a conservation student who spent most of her time working with fragile materials. Outside of school, she had built a small following online through quiet study sessions, just pages turning, notes being written, and hours passing without interruption. People watched because everything about her routine felt calm and predictable, like nothing in that space could suddenly go wrong. And that night followed the same pattern. She had permission to stay late inside a restricted archive room, something she had done often enough that it felt routine. The space was built for preservation, not comfort. No windows, a single inward opening door, shelves along the walls, and a long table under a fire suppression system that used inert gas instead of water. Earlier that day, maintenance had been done after a pressure issue was noted. And while the adjustments seemed minor, part of the safety sequence, the pre-discharge warning system, was not fully restored. By the time Lena entered, nothing felt different. She had access cleared earlier that week for cataloging and filming, something she often did at night for uninterrupted footage. The air and lighting felt the same as always. She sat down and began reviewing her notes at her usual pace. For a while, nothing stood out until something small shifted. She paused longer than usual, blinked more slowly, and briefly lost focus before continuing. And from the outside, it would have looked like simple fatigue. And that's the part that stands out to me, because most people wouldn't stop for something that small. Her pen slipped and rolled across the table. When she reached for it, she stayed lowered a second too long. When she sat back up, she didn't resume writing. And when she tried to stand, she stopped halfway and sat back down. There was no panic, just hesitation, like something had stopped working properly. The room stayed the same. She adjusted her posture, but her movements slowed and her breathing grew shallow without any obvious distress. Eventually, she leaned forward and rested her head on her arm, and it looked exactly like someone taking a break after studying for too long. Minutes passed, then more, and nothing in the room shifted, with the lights steady, the door closed, and no sound or signal indicating that anything had happened. I find this harder to process because everything still looks completely normal. The room hasn't changed, but something already has, and she has no way of knowing it. What Lena couldn't detect was that the system above had already discharged. Without the warning sequence, the gas had been released silently, replacing oxygen in the sealed room without any alarm or delay. And because the gas had no smell, no color, and no immediate sensation tied to it, there was nothing to indicate that the air itself had changed. By the time her body began to respond to the drop in oxygen, her ability to react had already been affected, leaving no clear moment where she could recognize what was happening and leave the room. Later that night, staff noticed that the archive room was still occupied well past closing time. And when someone finally entered, they found her in the same position at the table, her head resting on her arm, with her notes still open in front of her. Emergency responders were called. There was nothing that could be done. The investigation found no injuries or signs of forced entry. Maintenance records showed the earlier system fault had disabled the warning sequence, allowing gas to be released without alarm. System logs confirmed the timing, and oxygen levels inside the sealed room had dropped below survivable levels. The cause of death was asphyxia due to oxygen displacement. The system functioned as designed. It just did so while someone was still inside. And the next story flips that. It's louder, more physical, but the same idea is still there. Something is already going wrong long before anyone realizes it. It was September 14th, 2024 in Las Vegas, Nevada, and backstage at the bodybuilding finals felt dense and overheated. The kind of space where everything pressed in at once. Lights, noise, bodies, and time running in short windows between calls to the stage. Standing among the competitors was Viktor Volkov, his skin coated in oil and stage color as he waited under the harsh backstage lights. At 34, he ran a small YouTube channel with around 4,000 followers, where most people only saw the finished version of him, controlled, disciplined, and physically refined. What they didn't see was where that came from. In high school, Victor had been smaller, quieter, and often overlooked, and the gym became the one place where that changed. Over time, he pushed harder, not just to improve, but to leave that version of himself behind. That mindset carried into his content. His videos focused on discipline, ignoring discomfort and pushing past limits. And I've seen comments on videos like that, calling it pure discipline, like the goal is to feel nothing and just keep going. In the days leading up to the finals, Victor followed the same pattern without adjustment. His water intake dropped to almost nothing, sodium was cut, and diuretics and stimulants pushed his body under sustained stress. Each step was common, but together, they narrowed the margin for error in ways that weren't immediately visible. By the time he arrived backstage, nothing looked obviously wrong, but there were small changes in how he moved. He paused slightly longer between actions, pressed his fingers into the back of his neck as if trying to settle something. And when someone asked if he was ready, his response came just a moment slower than expected. None of it was enough to interrupt the routine. The backstage environment kept moving, heat building under the lights as competitors cycled through quick sets. Victor followed the same pattern, but unlike others who eased off, he kept pushing with the same intensity as content promoted. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage with the same composed posture seen in his videos. From the audience, everything looked exactly as it should, controlled, precise, and deliberate. He moved through the early poses smoothly, adjusting his stance and transitioning between positions. Then, he shifted into one of his signature holds, locking his body into full tension. Chest lifted, abdomen compressed, breath controlled. This was the part where he usually pushed slightly further than others, holding the pose just long enough to stand out. And he did the same here, extending it a second longer than expected, then another. At first, it looked intentional, like a deliberate choice to stretch the moment. And honestly, if I were watching this live, I probably wouldn't question it. I'd assume he was just pushing harder than everyone else, the way his content always showed. But the release didn't come. His shoulders stayed locked, his chest expanded, and his breathing didn't return to normal. There was a subtle shift in his balance that didn't correct itself. It didn't look like fatigue. His body held that position a fraction too long, then gave out all at once. His knees didn't react, his arms didn't catch him, and he dropped forward, striking the stage. The sound cut through the room, out of place with the performance, and for a moment, no one moved. Medical staff reached him within seconds and moved him off stage as the event paused, but there was no clear, visible cause in that moment. Backstage, the same heat and movement continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Victor was transported for emergency care, but the damage had already occurred. The autopsy confirmed a ruptured aneurysm, likely due to a pre-existing weakness in a blood vessel. Dehydration, elevated blood pressure, and sustained strain created the conditions that led to its rupture. Not a single action, but a buildup over time. Authorities reviewed footage and preparation logs, identifying a pattern of minor symptoms that didn't interrupt his routine, but pointed to increasing strain. I kept thinking about how long everything looked normal right before he dropped. Like the body was already failing, just not in a way anyone could see yet. And the next case is even more unsettling because this time, the warning is there. It just doesn't feel like one. On July 14th, 2017, in San Jose, Nueva Ecija, the rice fields stretched under a late-morning sun that barely shifted. The paddies reflected the light in flat sheets, and the irrigation water sat almost still. The air felt heavy, pressing down instead of moving through, and everything about the setting looked calm enough to lower your guard. Elias Navarro was 52, a widower who had spent most of his life working land like this. He also ran a small YouTube channel where he shared simple farming routines, spacing, water timing, how to read soil by touch. His following was small but steady, and people trusted him because nothing in his process felt rushed. Everything looked controlled, predictable, repeatable, and honestly, I find this harder to look at. It's the kind of environment most people would never question. That morning followed his usual pattern. His daughter Mara had been there earlier, helping with small tasks before heading home to edit footage. Elias moved through the rows the way he always did. Plant, press, adjust, step. Years of repetition had turned it automatic. Along the north edge of the field, the grass had grown thicker, leaning over the water where visibility dropped. The surface there was darker, harder to read. A small kubo stood about 30 yards away on slightly higher ground. Elias planned to finish one row, then rest. While crouched near that thicker patch, he suddenly flinched. It was quick, easy to miss if you weren't looking directly at him. He reached down and rubbed his left calf, pressing the same spot twice. He glanced at the water, but it was too muddy to see anything clearly. After a second, he went back to work. That moment matters, because in flooded fields like this, you don't always see what's moving beneath the surface, and most people wouldn't stop for something that small. Over the next hour, everything looked mostly normal. His pace stayed steady. The roux filled in behind him, but small changes started to show. Longer pauses between movements, slight stiffness when shifting his weight. When he finally stood, it wasn't sudden. He straightened slowly, adjusting his balance before stepping away. Then, he started walking toward the kubo. The distance wasn't far, but his steps had changed. Heavier, less precise. By the time he reached the bench, he lowered himself down using both hands. At first, it still looked routine. A man taking a break from the heat, but the details didn't hold. His breathing slowed in a way that wasn't just fatigue. His shoulders dropped, then stayed there. One hand slipped off the bench and hung loosely. He didn't correct it. His chest rose, then paused longer between breaths. There was no sudden collapse, no clear trigger, just a steady loss of control. And this is the part that stands out to me. Nothing around him reacts. The field looks the same. The light doesn't change. Everything stays normal while something clearly isn't. By late afternoon, the shadows had stretched across the kubo. Elias hadn't moved. When Mara couldn't find him at home, she went back to the field just before sunset. She found him seated in the same position. She called for help immediately, but by the time responders arrived, he had no pulse. The investigation focused on the area where he had been working. In the thicker grass near the irrigation edge, they found disturbed mud and a narrow track consistent with a snake moving through shallow water. Elias's left calf showed 2 small puncture wounds that had been easy to miss at first glance. Medical findings pointed to envenomation from a neurotoxic snake commonly found in flooded rice fields, consistent with species like the Philippine cobra. This type of venom affects the nervous system, gradually interfering with breathing rather than causing immediate visible distress. That explains the sequence. The initial sting was quick and easy to dismiss, followed by a gradual onset of weakness, a controlled walk to the bench, and then a quiet loss of movement. There was no struggle because there was no clear moment where the danger became obvious. The final report listed the cause of death as respiratory failure due to neurotoxic snake envenomation. And when I look back at it, what makes this case unsettling isn't how extreme it is. It's how little it takes. He didn't take a risk. He didn't push anything. He followed a routine he had done for years. But in that kind of environment, you don't always see the danger. And sometimes, by the time you feel it, it's already too late to do anything about it.